All right, welcome to the Seasteading Today podcast. Today, my guest is Steve Clancy. He is the co-founder of Eleutheria and New Nation Project. He is an insurance broker in Australia. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much.
Eleutheria is one of our business members, and it is a project to form a 99-year lease with an existing nation to provide a private city, and part of that is to build seasteads so that you can have a seasteading community launch from this private city. What else? Give us anything else to say about Eleutheria in the broad strokes? What else can we say about that?
Sure. So Eleutheria has been conceived of as a confederation, a new nation project in the sense that we do want legal autonomy. The extent to which we might be recognised or not by other nations is up for debate, but we certainly want to pursue something beyond merely a special economic zone. I think the best way is to look at it is to combine free private cities with seasteading, and that's certainly the model that we're looking to pursue, especially with our ventures in the Pacific.
So you started with the New Nation Project in 2023. So can you tell us a little bit about how that started and how you and your co-founders got connected?
Sure. It was probably after the COVID lockdowns, and I'm from Melbourne, so you're probably aware that outside of China, I think Melbourne was the most locked down city. The idea that relatively free Western nation could turn against citizens quickly due to hysteria, I think became really, really relevant. And so I'd always been libertarian minded. I say libertarian knowing that there will be some disagreement about what that means or the exact scope of it. But the idea of could we create a new city or a new polity that was separate from the existing status quo. Now, originally we had looked at could we get some land that's not claimed? There's a handful of places around the world, including what Liberland is doing there in Europe. We were looking at a different part of the world, and when we created the project, we thought we'll call it the New Nation Project, because if we just call it that piece of land, is it? Are we wanting to conserve it, preserve it? Are we wanting to explore it? What are we wanting to do? So we thought, well, the whole point is to create a new nation or a new city-state, and so that's what we called the project. Now, that particular area that we're looking at became, well, some would argue it was always untenable, but it became very untenable in 2023. And so whilst the project wasn't cancelled or put on hold, we had to look for other options. And looking at the history of the world, there's been plenty of cases where new polities or new types of polities have been created out of existing land, and that's typically through some sort of lease agreement with a sovereign. In a way, the Hanseatic League is an example of that, but more recently you're looking at places like a good example would be Hong Kong, where for 99 years it was considered legally part of England, but it was always a lease that could be renewed, and as the Chinese chose not to renew it, it reverted back to Chinese control. Seasteading is something that I'd heard about for quite a while, and I think it sort of coalesced that there was a real synergy between the idea of floating cities and floating communities and creating new polities, because obviously if you're restricted to land, then you are going to have to only ever look at leases from sovereign governments, whereas the ocean provides a much more expansive space in which to explore. On the other hand, though, the issue that I had with seasteading was the fact that the technology is still getting there in terms of scale. And so the idea then became, well, what if we could combine the two into a unit that would work together? And so that's when we said, okay, well, let's look at places where we could potentially lease. And typically you're looking at areas which are uninhabited. But if you want seasteading at the moment, then I think the best way, rather than islands, would be atolls, because of the protected nature of the environment within the atoll. And we looked at different places throughout, the globe, but in terms of the number of atolls that this could potentially work on, I think the Pacific has the vast majority of them, and that's where we've landed so far.
Now, tell me, was there a specific reasoning behind wanting a new nation, or was that sort of the default that most land is claimed by nations, and so you started out looking at land? And I'm just curious why a new nation, and if that confers certain recognition that you're specifically looking for?
The idea of the new nation is to have that, within reason, fairly full control over the sort of legislative framework and jurisdiction and legal framework that you live under. I think one issue with special economic zones is that they really are dealing solely with one area of life, which is that economic activity. And I think a lot of people who are pursuing freedom and who are dissatisfied with existing states, it's not purely the economic side of it. There's a lot outside of that. I mean, we might touch on it later in terms of the Christian ethic background of Eleutheria, but that would be one case where if you're a Christian, you may not really care if you've got a 0% tax rate compared to a 30% tax rate if you aren't allowed to teach your kids your faith, if you aren't allowed to worship. And we got very, very close during the lockdown period where even within our denomination, we got very, very close to real long-lasting divisions and animosity between members when the government stepped in and said, you can do this and you can't do that. And then the question of whether or not to obey the state and when to disobey started to become debated. And that had nothing to do with really economics. That was just about freedom of association and freedom of worship. And you'll find that in many special economic zones, that's an area where you don't have scope to change that. Like, for example, if you look at, say, Dubai, a lot of people love Dubai. I think it's a great special economic zone. But one thing that would prevent me, and I think a lot of people going there, is that you really don't have that ability to express your faith there. And, to be fair, it's a Muslim country. That's their land. That's their prerogative. And they've got every right to do that. That's, I think, where we're coming from in terms of, I think a lot of people, when they want new nation, it's because it's not just an economic, it's not just about low tax, it's not about a tax haven, it's not even about a reduction in regulations. I think it's a little bit more fundamental. What the government that you're under, to what extent do they have the ability to dictate your life? And I think that's what we're pursuing, is something that is, we're not anarchist and we're not laissez-faire in all types of morality. We do believe there is some sort of role for a limited government, but that's what we're pursuing, is that beyond the economic, it's the sphere of family, education, worship. Those are the areas where we wanted to have that sort of freedom that we, in the West, even though we've got great economic freedom, that those other spheres seem to be coming under more and more control of the state.
Sure. Very well said. Yeah. And so tell me a little bit more about these concepts of free market and limited government. How did you first become educated in these concepts, or become aware, be able to start speaking about them in regards to policy? When did that happen? Were you a kid, or were you older? Were you in school? How did you learn about these?
Yeah, I was probably, when I became serious about looking into it, I was probably about 15 or 16. And I heard about, there was this, it's probably died away now. There's a thing called extropianism, which is probably the precursor to longevity movement at the moment, but it was effectively had a lot of ANCAP and libertarian type political background to it. And via that, my most foundational wouldn't be Milton Friedman, it'd actually be David Friedman, his son, and that's Patrick Friedman's father. He wrote this great book called Machinery of Freedom, and I remember we didn't have a copy in Australia, and Amazon wasn't around at that time, and so I ended up David Friedman had actually put the book on his personal website, and so I would basically copy and paste chapter by chapter and then print it out so I could read it, take it away from the computer and read it, because it was back in the dial-up days where you weren't always in front of a computer for hours and hours. So yeah, I remember downloading, printing off. I had this very big thick copy of Machinery of Freedom. It was one-sided printing, and I read that and I thought it was fantastic, and that sort of opened up my eyes to look. My family background would have been small business. I suppose you could call it, in the US context, it would be, Republican voters. Here in Australia, we call it liberal supporters or conservative. I think because of the small business background, I think there was that idea that, initiative and entrepreneurship is important. We could see a lot of the negative effects of, arbitrary regulations. But Machinery of Freedom was really good to expand that, to really push the boundaries, to say, to question, for example, I mean, I would say I'm a libertarian and support limited government, even though at my heart of hearts, I probably am more agreeing with anarcho-capitalism. And I think that was David Friedman's book really expanded that and sort of pushed me towards exploring, questioning, do you actually need certain rules and regulations? Yes, you do, but you can question them and come up with a foundation. Just because they're always existing doesn't mean that they always should have been there. And I think his example of, I think it was an Icelandic period of where there was effectively like an ANCAP government in Iceland for so many hundred years. I think that was a really good example. And I must say, I don't think he gets the credit he deserves. I personally believe he predicted, or he basically came up with the idea of Uber decades before Uber came out, because he had one chapter in the book. I don't know if you read the book or if you remember. There's one chapter where he talks about like ride sharing as a potential, but back when he wrote it, the technology wasn't there to communicate, so it was more about pre-agreed routes. But when Uber first came out, as soon as I heard the concept of Uber, I thought David Friedman wrote about this in Machinery of Friedman. In Machinery of Friedman back in the 1970s, and I thought this is an example of the free. And it was one of those cases where Uber was actually completely illegal in most jurisdictions for many years, but they did it anyway until it became so popular and so obvious that it was better than the taxi system that governments then said, okay, well you can now do it. I thought that was an interesting thing.
Well, I would say not necessarily illegal. It's just that it was an innovation in a way that it didn't quite fit under a lot of jurisdictions' laws. Like it just wasn't.
It was legal in Australia.
It was, yeah. I mean, I think in.
Oh yeah, because you didn't have the. Well, when I say illegal, it wasn't a criminal offence, but you didn't have the. You couldn't go to the government and say, "Oh, I'm doing this business. Is it all okay?" If you asked them, they'd say no. But what happened is that people did it, and the government doesn't want to come down and well, at least back then, they didn't want to come down and arrest a 25-year-old student who's getting part-time income, or a 55-year-old who's getting a bit of weekend work. That didn't look very good, as much as the taxi industry probably wanted them to. And so I think it was. You are right. It wasn't. I wouldn't call it criminal, but it certainly wasn't completely lawful. So it was one of those business act, big businesses wouldn't support it, because obviously they're saying, well, is it completely legit? And the answer is, well, no, for the first few years, until the government said, yeah, okay, well, it is.
Right.
At least that's here in Victoria, but we're quite a left-leaning state. So
Sure. My experience in a lot of American cities, and I remember I was living in Austin, Texas, when they had a city ordinance that was addressing rideshare companies. It was just they didn't have a way to. They didn't have anything codified that specifically I like pointed at rideshare. I think that's a really interesting space to consider as a seasteader. It's that there are a lot of spaces where the law doesn't necessarily prohibit or enable certain activity, but it gets really tricky, and you probably know more about this, especially insurance. That was the big thing with Uber and Airbnb, I remember too, was that you couldn't get an insurance policy to cover having strangers in your car that are paying you to transport them. And that became complicated. And I don't know how quickly the insurance companies responded, but we're having, that's what the Seasteading Institute is working on now, is putting the codes, whether it's regulation or insurance policy or classification, it's putting down in some kind of system, some kind of writing to reassure the people who are investing money and insuring these vessels that there is a process in place for when bad things happen. Is that how you would view it, or do you have a different way of explaining it, being an insurance broker and having more expertise?
Well, as an insurance question, I think, look, they responded with rideshare within about a year or two, and then as soon as it was made legal, within about a year or two, most insurers were more than happy to do it. It's changed a little bit recently, only because the rideshare space has now become a higher risk activity than it was when it originally started, and so now they're changing. The insurers are still insuring it, but they're rating it accordingly. So the premiums are now approaching that of what they would charge for taxis. But I think the insurance industry is one of those ones where they are very responsive, very quick to innovate, but they will not break a rule. So if it is not lawful what they're doing, they will not do it. They will not be innovators. They will not be pioneers. They will not be groundbreakers like Airbnb and Uber were. So if you allow a framework that lets them innovate, they will do that. If the framework doesn't, they will not. They're not conservative like banks because they are in the business of risk, but they're not in the business of unregulated risk where they don't know that there's some sort of legal framework to fall back on. So that's why I would agree the classification is so important, because without that, it's not like you can just say, look, I'll pay a bit extra premium, to get someone to insure me because it's an unregulated risk. It's like you just won't find anyone. There'll be no one around to do that, and there aren't any markets anymore. When Edward Lloyd started Lloyd's, which was a coffee house back in the 1600s, it was literally you would find a handful of wealthy people would get together and they would agree to insure a vessel, and they would write their names under the contract. So hence the term underwriter comes from that practice. That doesn't exist anymore. You can't find that. I mean, probably the closest thing is maybe in the crypto space if someone wants to do something, and that's simply because so much of the crypto space doesn't seem to care about whether it's regulated or not. The problem with that, though, if you're an insurance customer, is that you're not able to find someone who's got a good reputation because it is so new. If you were to insure with I'm trying to think of a large American one, someone like a Liberty Mutual or an Allstate, if the product was brand new and they hadn't priced it right and they were losing money hand over fist, if you've still got your policy, you're good. So there's a degree to which traditional insurance companies do provide that necessary confidence there, but they're not going to do it without that classification. So that's why it's super important. Yeah.
Sure. Well, thanks for going on that tangent with me. Let's get back to Eleutheria. So you were working on New Nation project and looking for a location, and around that time, 2023, 2024, you learned about seasteading while you were looking for a location. Is that right?
Yeah, so that was when the classification project were calling for volunteers. So that was my first introduction to Seasteading Institute formally, and I really learned a lot. I don't think I was, I don't think I was very effective as a volunteer, but it was a very, very good learning experience. And reading through copious amounts of classification material, and just seeing how that side of the industry handles things was great. So yeah, and looking at it's interesting that when I first sort of connected in 2023, if you look at, say, ArcPad and Ocean Builders, where they are now compared to then is a fantastic leap. And I thought they were really advanced back in 2023. And it's amazing to see the technology is growing, is advancing very, very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And I do believe that it's at that point now where it's able to be scaled up. Obviously, most people in seasteading that are optimistic, so it may not scale up as quick as we all think, but I think there's many signs that point towards that. I mean, just looking at I'm probably most interested in ArcPad, mainly because those particular models that they've got are more suited to our Pacifica project that Eleutheria is promoting. But looking at that, where that was, I remember when Mitchell put his first posts out onto X and Facebook when they had the first HDPE tubing prototype of the Hexafarm, and it was very janky, but it worked. And then looking at it now, it's like, wow, that's amazing. And that's only a couple of years. That's probably less than 2 years since the first prototype went into the water. So it's really encouraging to see that progress. And I think we are at that point now where, with a bit more investment and time, seasteading really can take off.
Yeah, so let's talk about how Eleutheria would encourage that investment. So having a land lease with a nation, what does that bring to, does it bring stability to be able to innovate? Tell us about your vision for that.
Yeah, so I see when it comes to seasteading, I would say it's a very symbiotic relationship with our Eleutheria project in terms of the combination of that and the land leasing. So our particular proposal that we have at the moment, which is not approved yet, it's a proposal that's been before the Parliament of Tuvalu, which is a small nation in the Pacific. Their nation is made up of 8 atolls and 1 island, and the bulk of the population is on the main atoll of Funafuti. And so Funafuti is a coral atoll. There's, I think, only a couple of square kilometres of actual land, and that's pretty much well used now. But the rest of it is a coral atoll, which sits at somewhere between half a metre to 1.5 metres below sea level on average. So there's many places where at low tide you can walk, you'll get your feet wet, but you can walk across, from one area to another, and then at high tide you have to swim. But it's not the deeper coral where you have all those beautiful coral growths that you sort of think of when you think of scuba diving around coral reefs. It's a little bit too shallow for that, but of course it's not land, and so there's a lot of reef there that you can't use. But what the reef does is it gives a protection to the inner area, which is the lagoon, which is still seawater. It's still the ocean, but it's not the open ocean. Funafuti is about, I think, 50 or 100 square kilometres inside the lagoon. What our lease would propose is that we would lease a portion of the lagoon as well to become we would have our own jurisdiction over that portion of the lagoon. So within that, it means that if you put a seastead there, you're actually in the Eleutheria legislation area. So whatever laws we put for marine vessels will apply to that area in there. And of course, you'd be free to leave whenever you want to. So the idea is that we would from day one be very supportive of and assume that seasteads are going to be as important or more important than regular vessels that are going in and out of that area. And our proposal to Tuvalu at the moment, I think we're proposing about a 28 to 30 square kilometre. I don't know how that translates to miles, but 28 to 30 square kilometre area of lagoon, which would be a significant space where seasteading could be implemented. Now, I think the ultimate goal of seasteading is to have the seasteads and the seasteading communities that can travel from place to place to place and are not bound by any land at all. The position we're in at the moment, I believe, is that until we get that scale and until we get those very large floating structures that can provide breakwaters and that protection, there is a real advantage to be able to use a protected area within a reef. Now, if you put a seastead and it would work in Funafuti, there's 100 or 200 different other atolls around the world which have the same characteristics as that. So by having a seastead that's in Funafuti, okay, maybe it's not able to be permanently on the open ocean, but you could tow that to any other jurisdiction you want that has a similar sort of protected area. And in the future, if you can have breakwaters that are out there in the open ocean and they're outside of any jurisdiction, and you want to take your seastead from Eleutheria and you want to move it to your new project, with maybe that's at Atlas Island or something, you could do that. You either get a tugboat or you get someone to pull you into that other location. But in the 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years until that happens, you'll have a jurisdiction that is completely in sync with the ideals of seasteading. This is subject to, whenever I say this, I have to say, when we say we have full jurisdictional autonomy within this area, it's of course subject to whatever requirements are put by the lease. So the example I give is, I'm sorry to go off on a tangent, but we like to say we're not wanting to lease an area of land and we have our complete laissez-faire. We can do whatever we want without any regard to the government of Tuvalu or whichever nation happens to negotiate a lease with us. It's a little bit like if you're a tenant and you've got a lease with a landlord. When you have a lease with a landlord, the landlord can't come in, change your furniture around, add your furniture, take your furniture away, tell you what to eat for dinner. So you have full autonomy within that. However, the landlord has every right to go and say, well, you know what? You're using this as a residential apartment. You can't have a 24-hour rave club in there. As much as you might like it, that's one of those things that I'm not going to allow. And you say to them, you know what? I really want a 24-hour rave club. So the landlord says, well, maybe there's another commercial property that you could go to. And you say, fair enough. But it's completely reasonable. It's completely consistent with free market and libertarian ethics to say, if you agree to a lease with someone with private property, if they put certain covenants on what you can and can't do in there, if you agree to that, then that is acceptable. And I think that would be the case with Tuvalu. Tuvalu would most likely have a number of requirements to protect their marine environment, to protect some cultural aspects of Funafuti, to protect the built environment, and to protect their society and their population in as much as it relates to interaction with Eleutheria. So within that framework, though, having said all of that, because it would be Eleutherian territory, then you wouldn't have the rules and regulations that you have in all the other jurisdictions. And as you know, being in domestic waters, it's much easier to comply than it is with international ones, in the sense that because there are rules and regulations, insurance is much easier. You don't need to flag a vessel locally, but you have to register it. So what we would do is effectively give the maximum amount of freedom for seasteaders with the minimal amount of impositions. And probably the most likely imposition would be, if you're going to have a seastead, it needs to be insured. So, that's why I think the Eleutheria project, as we progress, it's really important for us that the classification project works as well, because, it may be that seasteaders in Eleutheria just choose to, and it may work out better that they just get flagged with Tuvalu. So we might have an agreement with Tuvalu that says if they fit this certain requirement for, safety and for non-pollution and for, then they're not going to burn down, at a slight wind or something, then Tuvalu would agree to flag it for a reasonable amount of money. And so therefore, that you're fully compliant with all laws. If it was flagged with Tuvalu and in those waters, I do know that we do have at least one marine underwriter who is able to insure these vessels. So we have a market there straight away. And then that, I think, is important. So having that regulation approved by Tuvalu and then enforced by Eleutheria means that now you've got one more market where seasteads can be insured. Now, it's not in the open ocean, that's okay, but it's a step. And the truth is, it might be 10, 15, 20 years before you find the technology where there can be low-cost mass adoption of protected breakwaters that are able to be floated into the open ocean. And when that happens, that's great. People can go there. I think the other reason that seasteading is also really good. Yep.
Well, I wanted to ask you more about Tuvalu and what benefit would they see from granting this 99-year lease?
The proposal that we've put to Tuvalu so far is we would endeavour to, as part of the proposal, if Eleutheria... So with the Tuvalu proposal, we call it Pacifica. The idea is that Eleutheria is a confederation of self-governing city-states. We've chosen Pacifica as the name for the Tuvalu project. So if that were to exist, we would call it Pacifica. And that doesn't preclude us doing the same sort of arrangement with other nations. They would have a different unique setup there as well. The Pacifica proposal with Tuvalu commits to raising enough capital and revenue for Tuvalu to fund their what they call their long-term adaptation program, or their LTAP. The current estimate as of 2020, I think 2023 was the last time we had an update, was it's about 1.3 billion US is what they estimate the program to cost. That's about an even 2 billion Australian, which is a lot. However, it's certainly doable if you look at Pacifica as a real estate program. So the Pacifica proposal is to lease from the government an area of the reef that we reclaim land onto, and effectively we are able to sell that land. And by sell, if we can use talking marks with that, it's similar to other jurisdictions where you can't buy freehold or fee simple titles, but you buy long-term leases. So effectively our long-term lease with Tuvalu would be for, say, 99 years, renewable. If you bought a parcel of land, you're effectively buying a 99-year lease from us, subject to the overall covenants there. Now, if we can generate a certain amount of economic benefit per square foot or square metre of reclaimed land, then that benefit is where we generate the money for Tuvalu's program. So the benefit for Tuvalu, the first one is we've committed to making the project be able to fund their long-term adaptation program. Now, their long-term adaptation program effectively involves their own significant land reclamation program to get more land for their own citizens. It's redoing their port that they've got, and it's also building a brand new airport that can take long-haul flights, which the current airport can't take long-haul flights. It would then allow them to relocate a significant number of the population of Funafuti onto this reclaimed land, which will be a couple of metres above the existing land, which protects it from not so much the rising ocean, but the issue with king tides and spring tides and storm surges. It allows them to go and then build up that existing land. So once the populations move to one side of the atoll or the reclaimed land area, they can go back to the land that is at threat of climate action and actions of the sea, and then they can build up seawalls and then rebuild that land. And so they effectively, I think they're looking to almost double the land available in Funafuti for Tuvaluans. So that's the long-term adaptation program. That's what they've put to the UN and asked for funding, but so far funding has been very, very small, and certainly not I think Australia's funded a small part of a precursor project to the tune of about 30 or 40 million Australian. So they're looking at likely to get from the UN sources maybe 30 to 50 million Australian per year. Now, considering you've got a $2 billion project, that's not going to get funded with small piecemeal handouts. So that's where we think the biggest benefit we've got in terms of the biggest immediate tangible benefit of our project is that if we can help fund that project, that's what they're saying they need to deal with the existential threat of climate adaptation. The other benefit we've got is on Funafuti, you've got about 5,000 to 6,000 Tuvaluans. There's one hospital, which is the only hospital in the entire country. The rest are clinics. I believe there's one or two doctors there. Most times you'd have to go to Fiji if you wanted more intensive medical care. A big issue that we found with market research with Tuvaluans is cost of living and job opportunities can be a real problem there. And so if you then had a free private city with seasteading right next to that population, able to generate a significant amount of economic activity, you've got immediately, we're going to need doctors, clinics, schools to support the Pacifica population. They're all available to Tuvaluans. So, for example, we'll be able to bring in MRIs, more operating theatres, more specialists. So you could have enough people that you could afford to have someone who's actually a cardiologist or an oncologist, which you couldn't have at the moment. So Tuvaluans don't have to travel internationally to get certain levels of medical care that could be provided locally. The other thing is Tuvalu they've just recently signed and started to implement an agreement called the Falapeli Union with Australia. Effectively, it's like a security union, but Australia commits to funding their climate adaptation. They don't give a figure, so who knows how small that funding will be. But one of the items that they have put a figure on is that they're allowing up to, I believe, 280 Tuvaluans to migrate to Australia on permanent residencies each year, which is great for Tuvaluans who need to migrate to get more job opportunities to provide for their family. The downside is that's 280 extra Tuvaluans away from Tuvalu. Do they come back or not? Well, even visiting is very expensive. But either way, they're spending significant amounts of time away from their culture, their family, and their heritage. This would allow Tuvaluans in Funafuti to potentially earn wages or income similar to that of Australia and New Zealand by being in the same atoll. So you could just take a boat across each day, or if you wanted to, work 5 days a week in Pacifica, earn significant money that you would get as if you had migrated to Australia. And then on the weekend, you're with your family, you're with your grandparents, you're with your cousins, you go to church together on Sunday. You're not separated from your community. So I think that's one of the biggest intangible benefits that Pacifica offers to Tuvalu is the ability to bring the revenue and the income and the facilities of the West so close to Tuvalu that Tuvaluans can get the benefit of it without having to leave and without having to change their culture either.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about how you approached Tuvalu and this process. That they haven't signed any agreements yet. So tell us what the status is and how you got to this point with them.
We had prepared a sort of a brief overview of this sort of proposal to another Pacific Island nation. There's about 5 or 6 nations in the Pacific area in the South Pacific which have geographies that are suitable to this sort of combination of an uninhabited island or reef that's able to be reclaimed, plus a lagoon area for seasteading. So Tuvalu is not unique in that. There's plenty of nations in the Pacific that have that. We approached another Pacific island nation that's somewhat similar to Tuvalu in its culture and its geography. We couldn't get past the government office with our proposal. We got a few rejections in terms of we don't quite get the proposal, we don't quite understand, and so rather than being obnoxious and push too much, we took that as we don't really think this is for us at this point in time. So we recalibrated and had a look around, and I believe that Tuvalu was just going through their most recent national election, and we just thought let's just reach out. Managed to find direct contact details for 2 members of parliament, one who was returned and one who was elected for the first time. and effectively just reached out through Facebook and said, "Hi, we have this project. Can we contact you and send through a draft?" And thankfully, it was very, very great. Two of those MPs came back and said, "Yep, send it through. Let's have a look." We sent through a draft. They had a few questions. They said, "Yep, sounds interesting. Maybe you want to present something a bit more formally." And then I've had some meetings with one of the ministers, and then then it got to a stage where last year, I think it was by October, so it was just before the Free Cities conference in Prague last year, we managed to get a formalised copy. Since then, we've become partners as well with Tipolis, and we're able to present our proposal to all members of parliament. Now, there's only 16 members of parliament, so that wasn't as difficult as it might sound, but we basically got a local agent there to deliver hard copies to all of the members of parliament. And then earlier this year, we had confirmation that, yes, it's been received by the parliament. Now, at this stage, it's important to note that no formal response in terms of approval or rejection has been provided. It's been received by the members of parliament, and it is something that we probably will have to wait on Tuvalu's next stage. Now, I'm hoping that what that will be is maybe an invitation to present a more formal proposal or to prepare some sort of feasibility study, which is most likely the next step. But that is something for them to reach out for us. They're For a small nation, they're actually surprisingly busy in terms of their government, and most members of parliament have a lot to do there. And Tuvalu's doing some great stuff in terms of it doesn't sound like much, but it's a big move for Tuvalu. They've just opened up their first ATM. So previously they didn't have the banking system that had ATM, so they've managed to get ATM on board. They've had Starlink as of late last year. Starlink's now connected. They've had another connection with a submarine fiber optic cable that happened last year. They finished their first land reclamation project last year as well, as part of what they call the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Program, or the TCAP, and that's sort of like the precursor to the long-term adaptation program. So they've finished that. They're a steadfast ally of Taiwan, so there's a lot of visits between them and Taiwan. Most nations will come and visit them. It was interesting. I had a meeting with one of the ministers, and the Zoom call kept getting delayed, and one of the delays was an ambassador. I won't mention the nation, but there was an ambassador who had a lunch that went a bit over, and they said, "Sorry, the minister's not able to make the Zoom call." And I said, "No, that's fine. I think the ambassador to that nation probably takes precedence at this point over Eleutheria." But no, they're very, very busy. They're very, very. I will say this: they're very, very open and above board with everything. So one of the reasons that we haven't been given formal feedback is that if any one of the members of parliament or ministers were to turn around and say, "Yes, I reckon it's a great idea, let's go ahead," they're conscious of the fact that they can't speak for their constituency, they can't speak for the cabinet, they can't speak for the nation, and it's a very consensus-driven parliament, very consensus-driven nation. So it's one of those ones where we're probably not going to get much formal approval unless or until such time there is some sort of consensus with that. So that might be a little bit frustrating for some who want maybe a deal to be inked straight away, but that's not the way these things are done there. So it is anyone involved in trying to pursue a project like this or any sort of project knows that there's always going to be delays. So we're at the point where it's now been made public. We're currently undertaking some market research with Tuvaluans in general, and so we actually have we've done some market research and some surveying with Tuvaluans themselves and getting feedback on the project. And I'm actually surprised at how overwhelmingly positive the feedback is. It's well over 95% approval.
Wow.
When we give them a basic overview of what the proposal would be. The main reason we wanted to get that feedback is we wanted to find out what are the concerns, because we had ideas about what would be a concern, but it's always good to get that from Tuvaluans. And it's interesting that those concerns that they're feeding back to us are very similar to what we had thought, and that actually helps to give us a bit of validity to the project, in that we think we're on the right track in terms of these are the areas that would be a concern. These are the areas where risks need to be assessed. And so far, nothing out of the ordinary has come up, but it certainly has reinforced the fact that climate adaptation protection of culture, and cost of living and job opportunities are really the main factors that Tuvaluans are concerned about, which they agree that this project may help with.
That all sounds very promising. I mean, it's the wheels of government always turn a little bit slower than I think entrepreneurs would hope, but I think it's really important. We've seen projects fail in the past when, the public response was not good. So definitely want to see it succeed and have that good partnership and not have it appear like it's not a partnership. So very, very interesting.
And that's one of the great things about Tuvalu as well is that there's only one other nation of a similar size, which is Nauru, which isn't an option we're considering because they don't have any atolls and their geography is not the same. But Tuvalu is about 11 to 12,000 people. So, unlike a nation of say 20 million or even 10 million or even 5 million, Tuvalu is such a size that we could talk to everybody. We could have everybody in the country look at this and give their feedback. So it's not just about convincing or pitching this to so-called leaders, community leaders, and we could pitch this to every stakeholder, and we are. Actually, it's interesting. Our survey went through via Facebook because Facebook has about a 70 to 80% penetration rate in terms. I think it's the most used social media platform, and the vast majority, I think 80% of Tuvaluans are online and have a Facebook account. The number of impressions we've had are such that about 1/3 of the country has seen Eleutheria and has seen our survey proposal, and the survey responses we've got. If this had been, I mean, it's hard to sort of scale it up, but if this had been a survey to Americans about a proposal, it would be the equivalent of about 1 to 2 million Americans responding to a survey. So that's not to say we have many thousands of responses, but Tuvalu is so small that we actually can go through that process of involving everybody. So it's not a case where you've got to, you're trying to pitch this to five or six cabinet ministers and then it's only their opinion. We're genuinely pitching this to everybody because, interestingly, one of the respondents to the survey is someone who, in previous years, had been someone almost at the highest levels of government and also at the highest levels of their non-government communities as well. So this is, the people that are seeing this and responding are people who you would consider to be very, very important stakeholders. Yeah. Well, I mean, everyone's an important stakeholder, but yeah. So you've got everyone from younger high school graduates to retired people to people who led businesses and communities and churches and even former members of parliament. So
wow. Now you just mentioned churches. So tell us a bit about the Christian values that you want to have in Eleutheria and why that's important. Just you've talked a little bit about that already, but I just want to reiterate, why is that important for the founding of this project?
Yep. So for Eleutheria, we've chosen to really put our flag down and say we are a Christian-based new nation project. Now, want to point out that we're not Christian only, and we're not wanting a theonomy or a theocracy where you have church leaders, rulers. I mean, well, for a start, we're libertarians and limited government, so the extent to which the state has control over your life is fairly minimal. But what we realise is that there really has to be some sort of foundational core belief system, and if you talk in, say, the West, especially the English-speaking world, and you'll say, oh, we have Western values or our core values. It's like, okay, what are those core values? What are they? And it's, oh, well, it's it's this and this and this, and it's like, no, you're telling me about the results. You're not telling me about the core. And we realize that the core values that we want to promote ultimately come from Judeo-Christian values. And so we may as well just go out there and say it. We are a Christian-based nation. Now, what that means is it effectively just means that we're not going to apologize if we're including God and the Bible in our understanding of ethics and politics. Again, it doesn't mean that we want churches to run things. That's not our opinion. I think the Westminster Confession of Faith, especially the US version, which is slightly different. It's a slightly more US version of it than the original English one written in the 1600s. is a really good example of the separation. I suppose what you call the separation of church and state, but in the chapter, it's about the magistrate. It talks about the particular role of different levels of authority. That probably explains where we're coming from, in the sense that we don't want to oppose churches, and we believe that every society, every nation has to have some sort of foundational common worldview. We'll choose ours to be Christian. Now, I am Christian, so I'm not saying I chose to be Christian so it would work. I am a Christian, and so that's why some of our founders are also Christians as well. We're not all the same denomination. I think probably the catalyzing thing that made us say yes, we'll just call ourselves a Christian New Nation project, was Jonathan Weinart, one of our co-founders, one of the people involved in the project. He founded a group called Nova Nicaea, or Nova Nicaea, as he would pronounce it, which is probably technically more correct. But Nova Nicaea is it's a project, or it's a movement to promote Christian communities within Free State New Nation projects. So he's currently, as I said before we started the call, he's travelling up to Liebestad at the moment to meet those people there. And so the idea of Nova Nicaea is to promote Christianity within various different projects. Eleutheria, we thought, well, that's really, really great. And we looked at what Nova Nicaea is, and it's a libertarian Christian framework. And Nova Nicaea, the name comes from the fact that we effectively say we will unite, we will work together with denominations and faiths that go by the Nicene Creed. And so effectively that means you're Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox. That's the sort of the rule book as to what's included in Nova Nicaea. But again, Nova Nicaea is really to promote Christianity within these free movements, not to dictate what they do or where they are or their actual composition. So from our perspective, I think because of where we are in the world today, we need to be a little bit more explicit about our worldview that we follow. If you looked at the early settlers into America, and if you look at the American example, if you look at the American Constitution, you wouldn't really look at it and say, oh, that's a Christian document, because it's not. And I think it was maybe crafted that way partly because it was sort of assumed that there was a worldview that everybody accepted. And so they were going to talk about the bits where there was disagreement, which was on how, the role of government and how government should be. But it's not true that America wasn't a Christian nation. It was. I think these days, though, you can't just assume that we're going to be made up of Christians. I mean, certainly we're not. I mean, even since we've been explicitly saying Eleutheria is a Christian free New Nation project, plenty of people, at least a good third of people who have joined up and subscribed or become a virtual citizen are not Christian. Most of them are just like, well, I can appreciate Judeo-Christian values as long as you're not imposing it on me, I'll go along with that. So even though we're explicitly saying we are Christian, we're actually still getting plenty of people who quite freely and readily admit that they're not, and we're perfectly fine with that. That's perfectly fine. The way it works with Tuvalu as well is that Tuvalu is, like many Pacific Island nations, they are explicitly Christian. Now they have a national church, which is the Tuvaluan Church. They, in their constitution, which was revised most recently in 2023, it mentions either God, Christ, or Jesus, or the faith about 18 times, which is very, very significant. In fact, one of the duties of a Tuvaluan citizen is to bring up their children in the knowledge of Christ and the faith and the practice of the church. I don't think the Pacifica Constitution, when it's written, would necessarily have that, but that's just an example of the sort of nation that we're looking to do this sort of sovereign lease agreement with. And so that, because we are going to be explicitly Christian in our background, that sort of influences the sort of nations that we would be looking to propose a sovereign lease with. We don't want to propose a sovereign lease to a nation that is, say, Islamic, even if there was one out there that said, we'll lease you this land, because it would be, we want to go build churches. We don't want to just build malls and a casino. We want to build churches and have them last. And so we don't want that nation to think, well, that's a bit rude to us. That's not our culture. It's like, that's right, that's not your culture. With Tuvalu, if we go and build on this reclaimed land, some cathedrals and churches, if our lease isn't renewed and the land is returned to Tuvalu, they'll still use them as churches. They'll still use them for their intended purpose. So that's one way. Sorry if it went a bit off on segues. Was that answering the main point of the?
Yes. No, I think it's not I think it's a subtle way of understanding how, or the way that values influence governance can be more subtle. If you don't want to be explicitly a religion governed nation, it has to be more subtle. And so I think it takes some nuance to explain and understand how that works. But I think an important thing you said is that you have people joining and you're welcoming people who aren't necessarily Christian, that it's not about excluding people who believe a certain thing. It's about supporting and upholding specific values. So I think that's useful, and I think that we shouldn't have a black and white thinking approach to thinking about that. So how can people get involved? How do you want people to support and reach out and understand Eleutheria?
So newnationproject.org is our website. We're happy that we chose that domain in hindsight, because when the first option that we were looking at had to be changed, we knew we didn't have to change the site. So it's newnationproject.org is the website, and there you'll find information on Pacifica, and there'll be options to either apply as a virtual citizen or to join for a waitlist. One way to get involved in the depending on when this podcast is released or when the person's listening to it, is that we are looking to open up I have to preface this a little bit, a sort of a quasi, it's a fundraiser, and it's sort of, we're calling it a virtual future land parcel voucher sale. And the idea is that we're opening up calls for donations and to support the project. And what we're saying is, okay, if you support, you can buy a virtual piece of land that may become land in the future, subject to all the terms and conditions of a potential lease if that eventuates. So it's effectively, if you if you log onto the website when it becomes live, hopefully in May, and you purchase a donation, and that maybe represents 1 square meter. So the idea is that if we get approval from Tuvalu to pursue with Pacifica, and then we get everything in place, we would effectively commit to allowing you to turn that donation that you made into some sort of title for an equivalent square meter of land in a reclaimed Pacifica. So the idea is that we're going to run Pacifica over about somewhere between 5 to 8 districts, and the first district we're calling Steelyard, just in honour of the Hanseatic League's outpost in London. When that's about 1 square kilometre. When that gets reclaimed, the idea is that the original supporters, get to basically get validation of their original support with some sort of voucher for a title of land. I mean, ultimately, you can donate if you want to for no return at all, or you could choose to then, if you got that title of land, you could always donate it to some project. There could be a sports centre or a church or a community group that needs some land to put a building on. You could always donate that there. We are structured we're structured as a non-profit association in Australia. It's the Confederation of Eleutheria Association Incorporated in the state of Victoria. So the actual legal entity is a non-profit association. So unlike some other new nation projects that are around there, we're not a VC-backed, we'd love to be a VC-backed, but we're not a VC-backed project that has shares. We're a non-profit. The idea is that if Tuvalu were to approve our project, then the Republic of Pacifica, or the city-state of Pacifica, would be created as a legal entity and effectively like a free private city. So if you look at the Free Private Cities Foundation and their model of private city being a city-state, that's effectively what would be created if we were to get agreement from Tuvalu. So Tuvalu would effectively say, okay, we will lease this land, and we will lease it to the entity, which is the Free Private City of Pacifica, which would be a republic of Eleutheria. So in that sense, then the legal entity running the project would be the entity based in Tuvalu, but under its own, but recognised by Tuvalu as a sovereign entity. Until then, though, we are based in Australia as a non-profit.
Sure. Now, Go back to, you mentioned being a citizen. What does it mean to be a citizen at this point?
At this point, it's all virtual. So I think the buzzword at the moment is you can become part of the network state. That seems to be what people are calling it now. But effectively, if you want to sign up, you just go to newnationproject.org, go to the apply, and then you can choose whether you want to apply as say a member or a supporter of Nova Nicaea, which is effectively saying you're a Christian and you're joining up as a citizen, as a Christian citizen, or you can be unaligned, which says no, I like the values of free market and the Judeo-Christian values. I support that. I'll be unaligned, and you can just tick that and then put your details in there. We've got a handful of members. They're all throughout the world. We only have a handful in Australia, but we've got people as far flung as Georgia, not the US one, the actual European country, Russia, Singapore, China, Germany, Hungary, all over the place. The US, a few in the US as well. So we've got virtual citizens there. Now there is also, we do have members of the association in Victoria. They're not always the same people, and it seems a little bit confusing, but that's the nature of running a legal entity here in Victoria. It has its own needs. Some people do join both and become a member of the association here in Victoria. That's available to people throughout the world, or some people just choose to become a member virtually here. And that's where we know that we've got people who aren't necessarily Christian, because there's still a significant number will choose not to join through Nova Nicaea. They'll be unaligned, and so that's where we know we've got about at least a third are still wanting to join, even though we're explicitly Christian. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Steve. And is there any final thoughts you want to share with the seasteading audience?
I think to briefly talk about the way I see seasteading as a pretty vital component of it. Like, for example, if Eleutheria was to be offered a lease of thousands of square kilometers in on the coast of Africa or something, some uninhabited area, would we be able to make our project work there? Yeah, I suppose we could. So then the question would be, well, then why is seasteading so important? And I think there's a couple of really important aspects of seasteading that actually make it useful for us. For example, if we look at the Pacific atolls where we're looking to reclaim land, the amount of land that we're looking to reclaim is in the order of, we measure this in terms of multiples of square kilometers. So not hundreds of miles, not thousands of square kilometers. Like, we're looking at, say, 5, 6, 7, 8 square kilometers, which is very, very, very small. So the question is, how do you expand? Well, it's like, well, once you've reclaimed that atoll, you can't expand. You can either go up and become like a little slither of Hong Kong there, or what also happens is the prices of land skyrocket. Now, good if you own the land, or if you've got a leasehold. Not good if you're a resident. And we want this project to be focused primarily on people coming from middle income countries. We don't want it to have to be populated by Americans and Australians and Germans and Brits just because their income is at such a level that they can afford it. We want it to be lower in income as well. So the prospect of being able to then expand into seasteads, as the cost of seasteads come down, this actually allows us to increase the amount of real estate. So if you've got someone who says, I just need an apartment, it doesn't matter if it's on a seastead or if it's on a piece of reclaimed land, as long as it's affordable for me and it's comfortable, I'll take it. And that's where, the amount of land, so to speak, available in the protected area of the lagoon is multiple times bigger than the amount of potential reclaimed land that we have. Secondly, by having seasteads that can be moved, that acts as a check and balance to Pacifica and Eleutheria. If we don't run the project properly, if we don't run the city-state effectively, people can take their seasteads and say, you know what, there's probably some other startup out there. I'm going to move this away. I'm not stuck here. And so, in a way, the seasteads act as a check and balance, because if they start leaving, that's a signal that there's something maybe not ideal or not optimized about this. Whereas if it's just completely land, choosing to move is a lot harder. So having that portion of your community who is there, not just because everyone's there voluntarily, but they're really there voluntarily because they can take their piece of land and go. That, I think, is really important, so that in future generations, Eleutheria doesn't try and become statist and devolve into more and more control, and less freedom. So when you've got a significant portion of your population who really do have the freedom to move, that's a good check and balance on any sort of government, and that's where seasteading have that ability. Seasteaders are about the only ones who can physically take their land and quickly and easily move. So that's the other reason why it's important, is that it helps us with extra land in terms of real estate for residents, but it also gives that check and balance that we don't become a bad government.
Thank you for that. That was a very good, clear explanation of the goal of seasteading in particular, but then also, working with Eleutheria. It's a really important connection to make, that this land lease, this free city that is based on land, is important for seasteaders to support. So I appreciate that.
The Seasteading Today podcast is produced and hosted by Carly Jackson. Send feedback and questions to podcast@seasteading.org. To support our podcast and the seasteading mission, go to seasteading.org/donate. If you'd like to learn more, read Seasteading: How Floating Nations Will Restore the Environment, Enrich the Poor, Cure the Sick, and Liberate Humanity from Politicians.